Amen. Great singing. So encouraging to my soul. Good morning. Many of you are probably familiar with the story of Oliver Twist. Maybe you've watched the movie or even read the book by Charles Dickens. When Charles Dickens wrote Oliver Twist, he was trying to shed light on the social injustice of child labor in 1830s England. The story revolves around a little boy he's nameless, he doesn't have a name, and he was eventually given the name Oliver Twist while he was in an orphanage that he lived in. And for the first 9 years of his life, he lived in that orphanage until he was transferred out of it to a workhouse. Life for Oliver was difficult, it was hard. He constantly felt lonely. He was always tired and cold and hungry. And there's this one scene where him and all the kids are sitting at the table eating little morsels of unappetizing food, and driven by desperation, Oliver Twist, he grabs his bowl, he gets up, and he goes to the well-fed overseer person, and he utters these classic words of, "Please, sir, I want some more." And his question just shocks everybody. It was like he had committed a capital offense for asking that simple question, "Please, sir, I want some more," or "Can I have some more?" And as I thought about this scene, I thought about one of the deep problems of our culture. Oliver Twist utters those words out of poverty and genuine need. But interestingly enough, all over our world, and our culture in particular, I feel like his words are really sort of an emblematic plea of our society. It's not coming out of poverty and desperation, but out of wealth and excess. Even though we have all these things, we have all this stuff, you could summarize American culture with that same phrase, "Please, sir, we want some more." I came across an article entitled "Discontent in Prosperous America." And the article highlights how Americans have more stuff now than we've ever had. But yet we're marked by unprecedented discontentment. The author of the article explains how the average American's income is astronomically higher in real terms over the past 40 years. 40 years. Our homes on average have expanded by 1,000 square feet, but our family sizes have shrunk. So we have more space than ever. The typical American diet now has 500 more calories per person compared to 4 decades ago. I could say more. 40 years ago, if you wanted to make a phone call, you had to spin a circle 9 times. Was that part of anyone's actual life? We're dating ourselves. Today we have smartphones that I can tell it to who I want to call, and it calls that person. And not only that, but it gives me access to the entire world, literally in the palm of my hand. The life expectancy is longer by over a decade than it was 40 years ago. And I mean, the author just goes on and on and on in this article, "Discontent in Prosperous America," about all the ways how we're much better off today than we were 40 years ago. And at one point, the author even asks the question, do you understand the average American citizen today has a higher material standard of living than the czars of Russia did a century ago? I mean, it is wild. But of course, the point is that even though we have all these things, we have more food, we have more space, we have more stuff, we live longer lives, we have more knowledge, we have more technology, even though we have access to the entire world, even though we have all these things, please, sir, Can I have some more? And the grass always seems to look a little greener on the other side. You see, we believe that lie a lot, that life would just be so much better if we could just have more, if we could just graze in not these pastures, but those pastures. But the good life is always everywhere else but where you are. It's never going to be found in the grass that you're already in. And so we tell ourselves, if I could just have that house, if I could just make that salary, if I could just have different parents, if I could just drive a car like that, if I could just do life next to a different spouse, if I could just look like this with my physique and my body, and the list just goes on and on and on. If we could just graze in other pastures, then our lives would be fulfilled and meaningful. Do you know what those things are functionally for you? They're your Savior. Those things could save us. It's called idolatry, friends, because God in His world hasn't chosen to give you those things. He's chosen to give you the things that you already have. And your constant reaching and grabbing for more is unthankfulness to God. But that's just how it is. Our hearts crave things they shouldn't crave. They long for more. The great reformer John Calvin, I mentioned it in my prayer, but he wrote in his commentary that our hearts are perpetual idol factories. And I can tell you right now, someone encouraged me, a pastor who doesn't talk about his struggles produces a church that won't talk about their struggles. My idol factory is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and I hate it. The grass always looks greener on the other side. Irma Vonbeck, she's got a book. She has a funny way of summing up this myth in her book, and she entitles it, "The Grass is Always Greener Over the Septic Tank." Isn't that true? You got that green patch in your house, and so the grass might look a whole lot greener, but you have no idea what's underneath it. You have no idea what's fertilizing it. And so you're like, Anthony, where are you going with all this greener grass analogy, this discontentment? Well, as you open the book of Ruth, and I would encourage you to turn there in your copy of God's Word, Ruth chapter 1, as we open this book, we're going to be in the first 5 verses this morning, really going at a quick pace here, and what we see is this Israelite family, and they're struggling with the myth and the lie of the greener grass. And as we'll see, they're going to fail miserably. And so what do we do with this? Well, there's this spot in 1 Corinthians 10, I think it's verse 6, could be wrong on that, but you can write that down in your notes, 1 Corinthians 10:6, parenthesis, maybe. And you could, where Paul, he writes about the failures of Israel in the wilderness, and this is what he says. He says, "These things took place as examples for us, that we might not be evil like them." And so I think merging that verse with a text like this is profitable for us. And what we can do with a text like this is that we can see this family fail with the lie of the greener grass, and we can flip it around and we can learn a very important principle for us, which becomes our big idea, and I'll put it on the screen for you. The big idea is this: trust God in the darkness by obeying Him. Trust God in the darkness by obeying Him. It's kind of one of those principles, it's a quote floating around, that we need to trust God in the dark with what He's revealed to us in the light. All of us are going to encounter moments of darkness in our lives, and maybe you're like, dude, I'm there right now. Like, I'm in the middle of the darkness right now. That could be a financial crisis, it could be a death, maybe it's betrayal from someone that you would have never expected to betray you. The darkness could be any number of things. Maybe it's marital. You're in the lowest valley of your marriage that you've ever been in, and it only seems to be getting worse and worse and darker and darker. It could be a diagnosis medically. It could be a relationship. It could be a sin struggle that dude, you constantly battle this thing in your life, and it leaves you in a state of perpetual shame and guilt. Maybe your darkness is shattered dreams. Life doesn't look like what you pictured it would when you were little. Anyway, in this text, the darkness that this family finds themselves in is a specific darkness. It's a darkness that's a result of, and I'll write this down, national rebellion against the Lord. That's the darkness in particular in this book. It's the darkness of national rebellion against the Lord, and they're experiencing the judgment of God. And we'll talk more about that in a moment, but kind of zooming out a little bit, I think you can generalize and principalize this with whatever your darkness might be for you. And so when the darkness of your life hits, the call of this passage is that the presence of darkness is not equivalent to the absence of God. I'm going to say that again because I think some of you need to hear it. The presence of darkness is not the equivalent of the absence of God. The call of this text is to know that and then to trust God in your darkness by obedience. There's a lot of ways you can break this narrative down. One of the ways, though, is by noticing that these first 5 verses give us 3 times in particular that we need to trust God instead of looking at greener pastures. 3 times to trust God instead of looking at greener pastures. Look at verse 1 with me. Let's go ahead and read the text and then we'll jump right in. Verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. Dun, dun, dun. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. He and his wife and his 2 sons. Verse 2, the name of the man was Elimelech, or Elimelech. And the name of his wife, Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died. And she was left with her 2 sons. These 2 sons, took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, funny name, and the name of the other, Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. This is the word of the Lord. Let me give you the first way, the first time that you need to trust God in the darkness. And it's in the darkness of evil days. Alright? Evil days. I want you to notice that phrase in verse 1. I maybe underlined it, highlight it, circle it. It says, in the days when the judges ruled. Y'all see that? Verse 1? With this opening line, the author is giving us more than just a historical time marker. This is a spiritual marker on the nation's history. The opening line is kind of like that famous Charles Dickens line, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Except that in the times of the judges, there really wasn't any best of times. It was just all gloomy and bad. There really wasn't any goodness to be found. And the reason is, you can actually turn back 1 page to the left, to the very end of the book of Judges, just before Ruth chapter 1. And the author really kind of sums up that entire book in chapter 21, verse 25. Are y'all there? You see it? Just 1 page back. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. But that sums up the entire book. If you've read the book of Judges, scholars and commentators, they note that there's this reoccurring cycle. Has anyone ever heard about this? This reoccurring cycle that happens in the book of Judges? It's a constant cycle that happens, and it goes from the people being in right relationship with God to then going into a season of rebellion, and then as a consequence, God acts in judgment toward them. As a result of God's judgment, they cry out to God for help and deliverance. and then God sends them a judge or a deliverer who then leads the people back to spiritual fidelity, and then they repeat the cycle all over again. They rebel, they experience judgment, they cry out, they get a judge, they return. And this cycle just happens over and over and over again in the book of Judges. But it's interesting to note that as you kind of like track through the book of Judges, and I know this isn't an exposition of Judges, but it's relevant. As you track through the book of Judges, what you observe is that there's sort of a shift that happens in the nature of these judges or these deliverers. Have you ever noticed this? So for example, the first judge, Othniel, he's a pretty good dude. He's upright, he's moral, he's a pretty good guy. But if you contrast him with the last judge, who is Samson, the differences are massive. Even though Samson, we all know about Samson, right? Like we've all had the felt boards, the long hair, super strong, donkey bone jaw thing. If you don't know what any of that means and you're new to Christianity, hang tight, it's okay. Donkey bone, whatever. But so he's consecrated, Samson's consecrated to God through a Nazirite vow from birth. But yet he's constantly violating his sacred vows. Instead of avoiding impurity at all costs, he takes honey out of a lion carcass. And again, there's some biblical baggage you got to understand to know why that's important. But if you read the book of Leviticus, you don't touch dead things. Can't do that under the old covenant. And yet he's eating out of a dead thing. For those of you younger in the faith, that's a really big deal, for the Old Testament. Instead of avoiding contact with the Philistines, he marries one. Instead of abstaining from alcohol, which was a distinctive marker of a Nazirite vow, he's having big drinking parties with his future in-laws. And then the concluding chapters of the book of Judges, chapter 17 through 21, they really just get away from that cycle altogether. The people rebel and they experience God's judgment, and then they sit in ashes while they're in the midst of judgment. And so the theological picture that the author of the book of Judges gives us is that this is a nation that has completely lost its way. They look more like the pagan nations around them than the purchased nation that God chose. And so what the author of Ruth is doing for us with this opening line in the book of Ruth is the author is tipping us off that this is a period of time marked by just utter disobedience and waywardness. Completely irrelevant for us, right? Wrong. And I think there's also a subtle application message there for us. This isn't really the point of Ruth, but I think it's interesting in the book of Judges. And the point is that the spiritual faithfulness of one generation is not able to secure the faithfulness of the next. This is true for a family. This is true for a local church. It's true for a nation. The next generation can ride the coattails of those who went before them for a little while, but it only takes time to reveal the true nature of their hearts, just like the book of Judges. And so the point that we're making here, though, is that this Israelite family that we're going to look at in a moment, they didn't influence the culture influenced them. The great evangelist of the 1800s, D.L. Moody, he once said, it's one of my favorite quotes, he said, "The place for a ship is in the sea, but God help the ship, the sea gets into it." Well, the waywardness and the rebellion and the sin of this culture made its way into the heart of this family. They just wanted to fit in. But to pursue union at the expense of truth is treason to Jesus. A.W. Tozer, he put it like this. He said, one compromise here, another compromise there, and soon enough, the so-called Christian and the man of the world looked the same. You couldn't tell the difference between this family and the world around them. And so the point that we're making here with this first point is this. You belong to Jesus. If you claim to be a Christian, you belong to Christ. You don't belong to the world. You don't belong to a political system. You don't belong to a sin struggle. These things don't own you. Jesus owns you. He bought you at the price of his own blood. You belong to him, and we're called to be holy. And holiness is it's not moral uprightness. We've talked about this. It's not just being morally upright, although it certainly does include that. We know that being holy is more than just being moral, because if you read the Old Testament, you have the temple, you have the tabernacle, these types of things happening, but inside those things, all these things were to be taking place. The candle was supposed to constantly be burning on the table of bread. There's supposed to be bread on that table all the time. There's all these utensils that were used in the temple. And if you read through the book of Leviticus, all these utensils, God says, are to be what? Holy. How can you have a moral table? What's scarier is thinking about an immoral table, right? That would be terrifying. Holy can't just be moral. And so what we get is to be holy really means to be wholly his. All of you belongs to him. Your body, your mind, your talents, your treasures, your time. Every part of you belongs to him. If you want to know if that's kind of true of you, check your calendar on your phone. What do you fill your time with? Where does your money go? Where does your talent go? What do you think about in your mind? How do you use your body? And as I consider this point, I thought about an illustration, and then I'll say this illustration, and then we'll move on, because we gotta get going here. But H.G. Wells, he was known for his famous and culturally provocative novels like The Time Machine. He also has another one called The War of the Worlds. He's got a lesser-known story called The Country of the Blind. And in the story, there's this luscious valley in Ecuador where everyone's born blind, and the valley is almost impossible to access. And so for this culture, there's no sight, there's no color, there's no news of an outside world. They had everything that they wanted in this forgotten, hidden, fertile valley. They had everything but their ability to see. Well, finally, a young man from the outside world, he was exploring the region, and he accidentally fell down a cliff, and he slid down and further down. And he landed in the deep foliage of a forest, and before long he made his way out, and he arrived at this hidden, fertile valley in Ecuador where no one could see anything at all. And so eventually he came into contact with the people who lived there, and he quickly realized that every single person he talked to was blind. And so anxious to kind of share his knowledge of the rest of the world, because no one ever heard about any of it before in their lives, he would gather as many people as possible, and he would begin to talk to them about things unknown to them. The colors and the beauty of creation. He would tell them about other worlds beyond their own, and they would sit with him and listen to him. And the interesting thing about that story is that in the end, they chose not to believe him. In fact, many of them started getting very mad at him and tired of his stories, and they concluded that his sight had actually caused him to become insane. But even though many of them concluded he was crazy, the young man decided to stay for a while and work among the people, and in the process he ends up falling in love with a girl who's blind. She's one of the people. He falls in love with this girl, and she's a daughter of one of the prominent families of the clan. And he makes this decision internally that he wants to marry her and settle down in this country of the blind. Her father was a respected elder in the community, and so he consulted with the other elders in the community, and they concluded that he could marry his daughter, but only if something radical were to take place. The elders concluded that the only thing that would cure this man of his insanity and make him fit enough for this girl he'd fallen in love with would be to what? Remove his eyes. So the father goes back and he reports all this to the man, that if the man would only remove his eyes, then he could marry his daughter. And so the man, he leaves to think it over. And H.G. Wells, he writes that he went to think it over in a lonely place in that valley there. But when he got there, the meadows were so beautiful to him. And they were filled with white flowers. He could see the birds flying overhead. And then he got up and he walked around and he could see the sun rising in the morning like an angel in golden armor, H.G. Wells writes. And he could see the sunlight shining down into the valley there. And then he realized this valley was nothing more than a trap of ignorance and futility, and he escaped from that country of the blind by the skin of his teeth. And so in a very real way, with this opening line, right, in the days when the judges ruled, this line tips us off that it's written during a time when the nation of Israel could be called the country of the spiritually blind. And as I read that, I thought about this quote by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, he says, "I believe in Christianity as I believe in the sun has risen. Not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." And so, the truth of Jesus, right, the truth of Yahweh for this family, the truth of knowing the one true God, it's not just doctrinal points to adhere to, it's the way to see. But here they're compromising the truth so they can fit in with the world. And it's as insane as agreeing to having your eyes plucked out. And that's exactly what this family is doing, as we'll see. But mark it down, the first thing to avoid in this text, the first thing to do is in the times when the days are evil. And friends, we live in evil days. There is moral corruption, political corruption. We live in evil days. The thing for us to do is to trust God in the darkness. Secondly, we need to trust God in the darkness of hard choices. Look at verse 1 again. So it says, "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah, he went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons." The rest of this verse introduces a lot of stuff to us, and so I'm going to make a few notes here, and maybe you'll jot them down as you follow along. We're introduced to this family. There's a man, a wife, and 2 sons, and they're in the middle of a crisis. And so not only is the culture morally bankrupt, but it's also economically empty because there is a famine. There's no food, right? There's nothing in the pantry. And there's an irony here that would have been immediately recognizable to the original readers. Bethlehem is a compound word. Beth, or bet, means house, and lechem means bread. So Bethlehem is literally the house of bread. No doubt theologically Bethlehem might be named that because one day the Messiah would come and he would call himself the bread of life, right? There's some significance there between Bethlehem and the Messiah. But also practically located about 6 miles south of Jerusalem, Bethlehem was just this place that was like teeming to the brim with barley and oats and olives and all of these things, all these crops. It was teeming to the brim. And so now though, there's no bread in the house of bread. It's like saying that the highest murder rates are in Philadelphia right now, the city of brotherly love, or there's been a rampant report of demonic activity happening in Los Angeles, the city of angels. This is kind of like what it's like. And I would go ahead and jot down Judges chapter 6 in your notes. Judges chapter 6, you can look there this next week in your own study. But when you read Judges chapter 6, there's a contrived famine happening due to oppression by the Midianites, this neighboring people group. And so some scholars believe that the same famine mentioned there that's coming as a result of the Midianites oppressing the Israelites is the same famine mentioned here. So you can study that and determine whether you think that's true or not on your own. But if it's true, there is one piece of insight we get here. That means it would coincide with the time of Gideon's leadership, and also the tension between Israel and the Midianites oppressing them. But regardless, what we do know is that there's not one square centimeter of this entire universe that God doesn't look at and say, mine. Everything is under the umbrella of God's sovereign control and rule. And as you read the Old Testament, which what you'll notice is that God often uses things like famine to get people to wake up and realize their need for Him. And so the proper response, and this is very important to understand the narrative flow here, so pay attention. The proper response was not to abandon Bethlehem. You see, as 21st century Westerners, we miss something that the original audience wouldn't have. To an ancient Near Eastern Israelite, in fact, to all ancient Near Eastern people groups in general, they had this understanding of sacred space, of land that was really meaningful. There's a spot in the play of, you ever seen Oklahoma, the play? There's a spot there where they say, "Oh, the land that we belong to is grand," or something like that. But what you notice in that little snippet in that play is that they belong to the land doesn't belong to them. That's kind of how they thought with the ancient Near Eastern worldview. They had this understanding of sacred space. The land was more than just borders. It was God's designated sacred space for His special people. And God has been faithful to call a people out of slavery from Egypt through the Exodus. He created a people by bringing them through water. There's some significance for baptism. And to bring them into their own land that He promised to give them. And He did it. This is the book of Joshua, where He goes on all the conquests and He goes before them and He gives the people of Israel their land. And here His people are in the land, and they're rebelling against the God who created them and made them a people group. And God issues this famine to wake them up. And so this famine wasn't designed for them to flee from the land of Moab, but to flee from their sin to God. Does that make sense? It's very important that you understand this to the narrative. But sadly, that's not what this family does. And this man, he chooses to leave his family, to leave his land, take his family, and relocate to the country of Moab. And so let's talk about Moab. All right? Moab was known for several things, and none of them were great. First of all, Genesis 19, this is R-rated. In Genesis 19, there's this scene where God is pouring out wrath on the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and somewhere during that process, this guy Lot, who's Abraham's nephew, Genesis 12, that's Abraham, his nephew Lot, him and his two daughters, they flee and they live in a cave in Genesis chapter 19. And the daughters reason to themselves, they say, you know what? There's no men that are ever going to be prospects for us because they're all dead and torched, you know. So what they do is they get their father blackout drunk and basically rape him. And the offspring of those unholy unions become Ammon, which become the Ammonites, and Moab, which becomes the Moabites, on the other side, on the eastern side of the Dead Sea. I have a map. Can I put the map up? There it is. You can see Moab and Ammon. They're in Bethlehem, right, on the western side. I'm so bad directionally. So the origin story of Moab is disgusting. You with me? Secondly, if you go to write down Psalm 60, verse 8, God is speaking in that psalm and He refers to Moab as a wash pot. And the kind of vessel that He's talking about there refers to a vessel that was used for cleaning dirty feet. It's an ancient Near Eastern way of saying that Moab is effectively the trash can. It's the grossest of the grossest type of vessel. That's what it is. You could jot down another reference, Numbers 22 through 24. what we read there is that the king of Moab is this dude named Balak. And Balak hires the false prophet of Balaam to curse Israel as soon as they come out of Egypt. That's Numbers 22 to 24. In Numbers chapter 25, the woman of Moab, they're attempting to seduce the Israelites to worship false gods. Judges chapter 3, during the days of the judge of Eglon, the Moabites were oppressing the Israelites. And so what I'm getting to see, in the biblical framework, there is absolutely nothing for an Israelite mindset, the way they thought, there's absolutely nothing and no reason why they would ever want to go dwell in Moab. Or that they even should go dwell in Moab. That's how the author wants us to see this, which makes it all the more devastating when we see this Jewish family who find themselves in a crisis of faith leave the breadbasket of the world to go live in the dumpster. Now look at verse 2. We've talked about this family long enough. Let's actually meet them. Verse 2, the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his two sons were Mahlon and Chilion. So here's the family, right? You get a man, a wife, and their two sons. Elimelech is sort of a compound word. El means God, E at the Eli means my God, and then Melech means king. So his name literally means what? My God is king. And then his wife Naomi, her name means gracious one, and they have these two sons. Mahlon means like weak or sickly, and Chilion means pining or whiny or crybaby, basically. Thanks a lot, Mom and Dad, for those names that we'll be stuck with the rest of our lives. And so you have sicko and crybaby. And I want you to notice this detail that the author gives us about them. He says in verse 2 that they're Ephrathites from Bethlehem and Judah. Y'all see that? They're Ephrathites. And you got to ask these questions. Why does the author give us all these details? Because he's trying to do something in our minds. The Ephrathites, go ahead and jot down 1 Chronicles 2:19. 1 Chronicles 2:19. What you learn there. So Ephrath was the wife of Caleb. Do you remember Caleb? When Moses sent out those 12 spies, they all go out and they look at the land of Canaan that's supposed to be theirs. God promised to give it to them. And they all come back, but they see the Nephilim there, these really big people there. And they come back, and the people are terrified. And they say, there's no way we can go take that land. We're like grasshoppers to them. But there's two guys that are like, we trust in the promises of God, bring it on. And it's Joshua and Caleb. This is a man of faith, extraordinary faith. Caleb was Joshua's fearless friend. And according to 1 Chronicles 2:19, Bethlehem was actually settled by the descendants of Caleb. And so the Ephrathites, they're kind of like this family within Israel that are like, they're like famous, they're like awesome. They have the blue check mark on Twitter. They're like the staples in the community, the model citizens. One commentator said it's like if you were an Ephrathite, it was like you were a Vanderbilt or a Rockefeller. That's kind of what the status that you had. As you would go down the street, you would, if you were an Ephrathite and you went to a coffee shop, people would look at you, they want to take a picture with you. Now, I know they didn't have coffee shops back then, okay, but I'm just, so you weren't just an average Israelite. Your name runs deep in the significance of Israel's history. And so, do you see what the author's doing here? He's trying to highlight their prominence and their notability and their significance in the history of Israel, only to emphasize their fall. This is very much a riches to rags type of story. If anyone should have stayed to help direct the nation back to Yahweh, man, it was these people. That they actually had the equity to influence this nature and the people, to forsake their sin and to rekindle a passion for the Torah. It was these guys that could do that. But here they are being led by a dude whose name means, my God is king. And he's leading them. He's failing to acknowledge God is king, and he's leading his family to the trash can. Why aren't they trusting? Why don't they believe that God is king even over their chaos? Why don't they think God is powerful enough to work through a famine? And so Elimelech, he stands in Bethlehem on the western side, just below Jerusalem. He stands in Bethlehem and he looks across the Dead Sea about 50 miles and he sees those highlands of Moab. He sees that greener grass. And he starts having these thoughts. Hey, you know what? I'm only going to go for a little while. I just gotta get past this famine. But God's not going to mind. You know, we're not going to settle down there. I know they have those church services to Chemosh, and they sacrifice little children to Chemosh. We'll just avoid those things. And hey, you know what? We'll even be a light in that area. We're just going to go for a little bit. And so captivated by that luscious green grass and captivated by what he saw just across the Dead Sea, Elimelech makes the decision to take matters into his own hands and lead his family out of the land that God wants them in to the land that he thinks is best for him and for his family. It seems like a very logical decision, doesn't it? As a father, as the leader of my home, I can understand some of those pressures and struggles. That makes logical sense to do that. But church, what seems logical oftentimes isn't the way of the gospel. You just look at the cross. Wait, but you're dying. You're hanging on a cross. The way of the gospel is illogical sometimes. Staying in that marriage instead of bolting might seem absurd. Giving sacrificially doesn't make sense. Blessing those who curse you, I don't really compute with that. Worshiping even in my ashes, I don't understand that. Sometimes the way of Jesus looks like the most illogical thing to do, but it is the way of worship. And I know that grass might look greener on the other side of that financial decision for your business, that trade-off, whatever. The greener grass might look more exciting. It might even advance you physically, but the real you that God designed you to become, that's only going to come through obedience. I also want you to notice a progression. In verse 1, can you circle the word sojourn? That's all they wanted to do initially, was to sojourn in the land of Moab. That word means a temporary visit. In verse 2, I want you to circle the word remained. The word literally in Hebrew means to be or to become. And then finally, I want you to circle that phrase, they lived there about 10 years. It's a slow drift, isn't it? One sinful decision, one refusal to seek the wisdom of God, one instance of taking matters into your own hands, leading you and your family to where you think is best for you and your family to go without consulting God and asking what he thinks about it. It reminded me of C.S. Lewis's book, The Screwtape Letters. I know I've referenced it before in my sermons. C.S. Lewis writes this book called The Screwtape Letters, and it's a novice demon seeking counsel from his experienced expert demon uncle. His name is Screwtape, and his uncle's name is Wormwood. And Wormwood is instructing his younger nephew, Screwtape, on how to work with his patient. You are the patient, you. And in one spot, C.S. Lewis, he's writing, as this demon, Wormwood, and this is what he says. I'm kind of paraphrasing it. He says, Screwtape, obviously you're making excellent progress with your patient. My only fear is that in attempting to hurry your patient away from God, you might actually wake him up to the reality of his real position. We see where he is, as he really is. We've introduced change of direction in his course, and we know that he's already in the process out of his orbit from God. But you need to keep him thinking that all of his decisions that he's making are just trivial and they're revocable. They're not that big of a deal. At all costs, you can't allow him to suspect that he is right now slowly heading away from the sun on a line that will carry him out into the utter cold and darkness. It's a slow drift. And isn't it interesting that as these types of decisions are being made in the heart of this family, the first 5 verses of the book of Ruth are the only section in the entire book where God's name isn't mentioned, not even one time. And listen, making decisions without even asking the question of what God thinks about it, it's not like fire is immediately going to consume you in your life. These guys enjoyed prosperity and provision for 10 years. 10 years. Life was good from this decision that they made. They had a place to call home. They had found brides for their sons. Life seemed pretty good, but as they left the land and they cut themselves off from the people of God, they also forfeited church membership. I know that's kind of a joke there, but they forfeited church membership and their access to participate in the assembly of God. That's Deuteronomy 23. You can jot that down. Deuteronomy 23. As they were making all of these small decisions, they were being lulled out to the cold and darkness out of their orbit from God. And as the story goes, this prominent patriarch, Elimelech, as he took his family away from the land of promise and into the land of compromise, he would never, ever make his way back home again. We need to trust the Lord in every difficult decision. As you make a financial decision, like listen, when I do with people about their problems, it is so often the case that they're making decisions and they have all these reasons that they throw at me for why they're making certain choices, and not one time do people ask the question about what God thinks. Do you think about what God wants for you in your life when you make decisions about what job to take, about how to argue in your marriage, about where you should move, about what you should do? I just feel like so often we drift into practical atheism. We know all the creeds, we know all the tenets, but we're devoid of a life that has God as our lens. We need to trust the Lord in every difficult decision and lean not on our own understanding, but in all our ways acknowledge Him, and He will make our paths straight. One more. I know some of you are like, oh my goodness, one more. Oh, you faint of heart. It's a short one, so hang tight. Number 3, third time that we need to trust the Lord in our darkness is this: painful loss. Painful loss. Look how the section ends, and we'll be brief. Verse 3, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Verse 4, these took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah. Can you all say Orpah? Guess what that name means? It means strong-necked. It's an attractive name for a female. Or it literally means stiff-necked. It's a common Old Testament expression for obstinance, difficulty. The other's name was Ruth, and her name means friend or companion. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So this woman survived her husband and her 2 sons. They thought this was going to be great. They made a choice and they said, let's go to Moab. And so they go to Moab looking for life, and in the process they lose their lives. They went to Moab thinking that they were going to start this great new life together, but instead all they found were 3 graves. Do you remember what Jesus said in the Gospels? That if you seek your life, you'll lose it. But everyone who loses their lives for my sake will find their lives. Gospel economics don't really work the way we think they do. There's a lot of loss and pain compressed into these few verses. This woman loses everything. She loses her husband, she loses her sons, She loses her family name. She loses her inheritance. Everything gone, leaving her in an extremely vulnerable position, which is a very important concept for the rest of this book. But we're not told how these deaths occurred. Could have been disease. After all, one of them's name was Sicko. It could have been some kind of plague. We don't really know, because we're not really told. But most Jewish writers and evangelical scholars, they read between the lines and they contend that their deaths were acts of divine judgment on their unbelief and disobedience. It's kind of like that situation in the book of 1 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, the church members there are facing untimely deaths due to their participation in the Lord's Supper, all the while harboring and planning and engaging in sins that they didn't discern, namely not acknowledging or discerning the body of Christ, probably a dual reference both to the sacrifice of Jesus, but then also his body, us, the church. And so it seems that these sons, they followed in their father's footsteps by disobeying the Lord. They refused to return. They abdicated their responsibility to lead their families in the ways of Yahweh. They failed to bring their father's body back to the land that was theirs. And they just displayed complete indifference to their faith. It all started out pretty great. Nice 4-bedroom tent, 2-camel garage. Probably had memberships at the local donkey lodge down the street. Life's good, and then one night Naomi gets a knock on her door or a phone call. Ma'am, your husband's dead, your sons are dead. Need you to identify the bodies. And as the paragraph concludes in verse 5, Naomi finds herself virtually all alone. And she's left to ponder and think with a heavy heart. The swift passing of a decade and wondering, where did it all go? There's the first 5 verses. But this isn't the end. And actually, all of this is only setting the stage for a redeeming God who has a way of taking people who are lost in Moab and setting their feet back on the path to Bethlehem. Maybe today you find yourself already in Moab, spiritually speaking. Maybe you've already been making those small choices that are effectively packing your bag so you can make the journey to Moab. Maybe you're solidly planted in the land of promise right now, but out of nowhere, a famine has come into your life and you're beginning to ponder greener grass. Of how life could be so much better if you could just get out of the pastures that God's placed you in to graze in others. Wherever you are, hang tight and get ready to watch a God who has a way of redeeming wasted years and foolish decisions that bring you once again to the feet of Jesus, your kinsman, Redeemer. Will you pray with me? Father, thank you for this amazing text. We thank you for the book of Ruth. We're excited to see how you will use this book in our lives to encounter your grace and your forgiveness and your mercy. We're excited to see you work through the darkness so that when we find ourselves in our own, we would respond by trusting in you through obedience. I'm going to invite you to stay there in a posture of prayer and pray whatever it is you need to pray to the Lord in response to these first 5 verses.
Let's stand and we'll close in worship together.
close, we'll read a passage of Scripture. Before we do, I want to remind you that we have a family meeting immediately following this. It's 11:07, probably get started around 11:15. We don't want to keep you here too long. There are some ballots that we're voting on two things. So there's some ballots back at the tech booth. Adam, is that right?
Yes.
And Adam is going to be taking record of who receives a ballot, because we file that stuff away, we make note of that stuff. And so grab a ballot if you're a member, and then try to be ready to go by 11:15. And if you are not a member and you want to see how it functions, again, we invite you to stay. We would love for you to see our family meeting and how we function together in making decisions. So, all right, Psalm 62, verses 7 and 8. Let's read this together. On God rests my salvation and my glory. My mighty rock, my refuge is God. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. Selah. Amen. Keystone Bible Church, may the Good Shepherd who laid down his life for the sheep, may he continue to be your faithful shepherd who defends you from all evil, who delivers you from all fear, and who protects you from your own folly, and who carries you all the way home at last with rejoicing. Keystone Bible Church, you are loved, you're prayed for, and you are sent to live the mission of Jesus.